There we go. Okay, hi everyone. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. Tonight we're joined by Dr. Lucy Harry of the University of Oxford. She's a graduate of the University of St Andrews and then went back to Oxford for your master's. Is that correct?
Yes.
Fantastic. And now as a postdoctoral researcher, she works as part of the Death Penalty Research Unit. Her PhD has involved a lot of different international applications of the death penalty and its utilisation in countries like Kenya and places like that. And we're all really interested to hear what you're going to say today. So looking forward to it.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for the kind invitation and for organising this event. Yeah, it's a real honour to be speaking at the Open University. I'm just going to share my screen and just bear with me one moment. Oh gosh, now I can't see.
That looks right to me. No, not quite.
Is that okay?
Yeah, I would say so. That looks right to me.
Okay, great. I should also preface before we start that I have two quite overexcited dogs with me right now, so who might like to interject at inappropriate moments. So just bear with me if that happens. But yeah, thank you so much for the kind invitation and also for the introduction. As the slide says, and as you've heard, my name's Lucy Harry, and I'm a researcher at the Death Penalty Research Unit at the University of Oxford, which I promise I'm a more cheerful person than that job title might suggest. And tonight I have been asked to speak about the death penalty and given sort of a broad remit. So I hope I'm okay in taking some creative license. And tonight I'll be talking about my research on women sentenced to death for drug trafficking in Malaysia, which form the basis of my doctoral research. So my guess would be that when you think of the death penalty, you might think about the death penalty in the United States and the lethal execution there, which is why on this first slide, I have a photo of an execution chamber from the United States. And this is because a lot of attention is given to the US death penalty, both in popular culture, but also in academic literature. Much of this focuses on its jurisdiction. Which may perhaps obscure the situation, as in fact 55 countries around the world still retain the death penalty. And in fact, 90 to 95% of the world's executions actually occur in the Asian region, which is where my research is based. Yet this part of the world receives comparatively far less attention than the US when it comes to capital punishment. So I'm hoping to perhaps broaden your perspective on the death penalty this evening by focusing on a jurisdiction in Southeast Asia. So as I've just said, 55 countries around the world retain the death penalty. The different types of crimes that warrant capital punishment range from murder or homicide, drug-related offences, which form the basis of my research, economic crimes such as corruption, blasphemy, kidnapping, rape, and crimes against the state, so terrorist offences or treason, for example. The infographic on the slide includes a list of the countries that still retain the death penalty, and this comes from Amnesty International's annual report on death sentences and executions worldwide. And I'd highly recommend having a look at those reports if you're interested in learning more. They come out every year and they're very authoritative. So I hope that this question is self-evident, but in case it's not, here are some reasons why we should abolish the death penalty worldwide. And again, I've borrowed this infographic from Amnesty's website. So as I'm sure you know, as law students, wrongful convictions occur in criminal justice systems. And due to the irreversibility of the death penalty, it would be really catastrophic if an innocent person was executed, which invariably happens just because, as we know, mistakes do happen in the criminal justice system. So this is one of the arguments for why it should be abolished, because of the potential for mistakes to happen. It does not deter crime. So while deterrence is one of the key justifications that political leaders cite for retaining the death penalty, in fact, considerable academic research has shown that this is in fact untrue. And I'd be happy to recommend studies about that if anyone's really interested. Often the death penalty is imposed by states who do not meet international standards on fair trials. And I'll be talking a bit later in my presentation about some fair trial fair trials concerns in Malaysia as well. It's discriminatory and arbitrary. It often targets the most minoritized and marginalized groups in society. And with my research, we'll see that the death penalty targets economically precarious foreign national women in the Malaysian context. And finally, it's used as a political tool to punish political opponents. This is less relevant to Malaysian jurisdiction, but is for other jurisdictions such as Iran and Sudan, as it says on the slide. So, as I mentioned, every year Amnesty produces reports with its monitoring on the use of the death penalty, and the most recent statistics come from 2021, where there were 579 executions, which was a 20% increase from the previous year. 2,052 death sentences were passed, which again is an increase from 2020, and a total of 28,670 people were on death row worldwide by the end of the year. So I feel like that bears repeating because it's quite a staggering statistic, but 28,670 people under sentence of death worldwide. This is a bit gruesome, but to underscore the brutality of it, the kind of execution methods that were used last year included beheading, so most notably in Saudi Arabia, but also electrocution, hanging, lethal injection, and firing squad. And on the bottom of the slide is some more information from Amnesty about where the executions occurred last year. So we see that many executions occurred in Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and other places, and some such as China and North Korea and Vietnam are listed on there as having carried out executions, but we don't know the exact number because there's a lot of state secrecy when it comes to the death penalty. So gathering statistics is really difficult. But we imagine that China is probably one of the greatest executors in the world, but we don't know the exact numbers. So my research looks at the death penalty for drug trafficking, and I thought I would give you some information on that. So worldwide, 35 countries retain the death sentence for drug offences, and this is largely concentrated in the Middle East and Asia. And indeed, as I previously mentioned, over 90% to 95% of the world's executions occur in the Asian region, and this is largely due to the death sentence for drug trafficking. Crucially, though, the death penalty for non-violent drug offences is actually in contravention of international law, as Article 6 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, or ICCPR, states that the death penalty should only be retained for the most serious offences, and that's generally understood in international law to mean offences with lethal consequences, i.e. intentional homicide. And although this graphic's a little bit out of date now because it's from 2008 to 2018, it states that nearly 40% of all global executions were for drug offences during that time period. So I just included that just to illustrate that the death penalty is, and executions for drug offences are used with relatively high frequency. And that infographic's from an NGO called Harm Reduction International, who do a lot of research and advocacy on the issue of the death penalty for drug offences. So I'd point you to their work if you would like to learn more about that. Before providing the details of my research findings in Malaysia, I think it would be helpful to provide some context about the use of the death penalty in Southeast Asia, which is utilised as part of the region's war on drugs. And this is related to the geographical region. So Southeast Asia encompasses the Golden Triangle, which is where the borders of Laos, Myanmar, and Thailand meet. And this area is the second greatest producer of narcotics in the world. Previously, this was where heroin was produced, but since the 1990s, there's been a switch to methamphetamine, and Asian leaders frame drug offences as the most serious offences that require the most punitive responses. And you can see on the slide in the bottom right-hand corner is the former President Duterte of the Philippines, who is brandishing a gun in his war against drug users. Here it's argued that drug offences are worse than homicide because a murder kills one person, whereas someone trafficking drugs could get multiple people addicted with just one shipment, or so their argument goes. and its claim that the drug issue is a national security problem that threatens an entire generation. So there's a concern that the younger generation will all become addicted to drugs. And so the death penalty is used against drug traffickers as a way of deterring people from engaging in the drugs trade. And indeed, I don't know if you've traveled there before, but when you fly into some Southeast Asian countries, such as Singapore and Indonesia, you're reminded at the airport, at the border, that drug trafficking carries the death penalty, by which point it's probably too late for you anyway. But and some authoritarian leaders in Southeast Asia, such as the former president of Singapore, have also argued that the death penalty is an Asian value, and that in Asia, people value the community over individuals' human rights. So in this way, they argue that they can sacrifice the life of one drug trafficker in order to protect an entire community or society from drugs. However, as you can imagine,
can I just intervene quickly, Lucy? I'm just gonna. It's just we're having just a slight little bandwidth problem. I'm gonna turn my camera off, but I'll be here. I promise. I just when I go, my screen will go black, but I'm gonna turn my camera off, and that way, hopefully, the bandwidth will be preserved for your call rather than for just me sitting watching.
Oh, perfect. Can you hear me? Okay, is that the issue? Oh, you're on mute. Sorry.
There's just the occasional little drop, but it's almost nothing. But I just think if I turn my camera off, that'll probably help.
Okay,
but I don't want you thinking that I've just fled the scene. I promise that I'll be here.
Yeah, and feel free to stop me if I mean I could turn off my camera if that would help things.
No, not at all. Not at all. Be absolutely fine.
Okay. But yeah, so commentators have critiqued this idea about the death penalty being a so-called Asian value. Because, as you can, and have said that it's instead used for instrumental purposes by authoritarian leaders, because obviously the idea of having one homogenous set of Asian values is problematic. And so overall, it's important to note that the war on drugs, and indeed the death penalty for drug trafficking in Southeast Asia, mainly affects those at the very lowest rungs of the drugs trade. So usually drug couriers or mules who are motivated by economic factors and are not major profiteers nor drug kingpins. And indeed, this is what I find through my research. So I'm now going to give you a very brief overview of the death penalty for drug trafficking in Malaysia. So this is governed by the Dangerous Drugs Act of 1952, which was instituted during British colonial rule, but at the time it did not carry the death sentence. The death penalty for drug offences was introduced in 1975 after independence, and the mandatory death sentence was later introduced in 1983 as part of the government's anti-drugs campaign. So although the death penalty as a form of punishment was inherited from British colonial rule, it wasn't a capital offence during colonial times. It was only after independence that the Malaysian government thought that drug trafficking should be considered a capital offence. And while some limited reforms to the mandatory death sentence for drug trafficking occurred in 2017, it still remains largely mandatory in practice because the amendments to the Dangerous Drugs Act were very restrictive. So in practice, it's quite hard to satisfy. So most people are still sentenced mandatorily. Hanging is the execution method in Malaysia, and the current use of the death penalty tends to be restricted to the crimes of homicide, drug trafficking, and occasionally firearm offences. And although these statistics are hard to come by, Amnesty International estimates that 30 executions have occurred from 1998 to present, and the last known execution occurred in 2017. But since then, there's been a moratorium, which means that there's been an official halt on executions. This is because on the 13th of October 2018, on World Day Against the Death Penalty, the then Law Minister Loo Wee Kong announced that the country planned to abolish the death penalty. However, they've since reneged on this, and now there are plans just to abolish the mandatory death penalty, but to still keep the discretionary death penalty as a punishment. I'm just checking that the bandwidth is okay and still following.
Everything's absolutely fine. In fact, from the comment section, it seems like it was actually just me being based in Scotland that was the problem rather than anyone else. I think it was just me that was experiencing little blips rather than anything else. Absolutely fine. Absolutely.
Brilliant, thank you. So who is on death row in Malaysia? Well, statistics are quite hard to come by, but in 2019, Amnesty International published a report that found that as of February that year, there were 1,281 people on death row. Of that, there were 1,140 men and 141 women. There are an alarming number of foreign nationals, so 44% of the total death row population are foreign nationals. And crucially for my research, a higher proportion of women are on death row for drug trafficking. So 95% of the women on death row are there for drug trafficking, as compared to 70% of the male death row population. And additionally, a higher proportion of the women on death row are foreign nationals, so 86% as compared to only 39% of the male death row population. So what this shows is that there are a disproportionately high number of foreign national women sentenced to death for drug trafficking in Malaysia. And this is what my research sought to understand. So I conducted fieldwork in Kuala Lumpur in early 2020, just prior to the pandemic. And I was trying to investigate why there are this disproportionate number of foreign national women sentenced to death for drug trafficking in this jurisdiction. And for ethical and access reasons, I did not attempt to interview any of the women on death row themselves, but I spoke with lawyers, prosecutors, judges, police, NGO activists, consular officials for foreign national women, journalists, and others who were connected to these women's cases. I also conducted systematic searches of legal and media databases for information on women's cases and developed a database of 146 cases from 1983, which is when the death penalty became mandatory, to 2019. From analysing my data, I was wondering, why and how women become involved in the death penalty, that become involved in drug trafficking that leads to the death penalty. And my background's more sociological than it is legal. So I was wondering why it was that women were becoming involved in these activities that led to them being sentenced to death. And I found the concept that helped me to make sense of my findings was what is known as the feminization of migration, which I've written on the screen. This is a trend that's emerged worldwide since the 1980s, particularly in the global South. Because whereas historically economic migration was portrayed as a male process, mainly involving men, since the dawn of globalization and industrialization, we've seen increased numbers of women migrating for work as the breadwinner in order to send home remittances to their family in their home country. An example of this being the Philippines, where 3/4 of their migrant workers are female. So how does this relate to my work? Well, I found that many of the foreign national women on death row in Malaysia tended to be from other countries in the global South. So the most common nationalities were Chinese, Indonesian, Iranian, Malaysian, Thai, and Filipino women. And many of the women were migrant workers who were working as domestic workers who were traveling for other forms of precarious gendered labor in the region. For example, they were traveling to work in a massage parlor, and they claimed that they were duped by their recruiter, who asked them to carry a bag to their new employer, or who offered them a new suitcase to put their possessions in, which later turned out to have drugs concealed within it. Many others claimed that they were working as what's known as a cross-border informal trader, where they are paid to courier items in their personal baggage across borders in order to avoid customs duties. This is an established practice that often occurs in the global South and is dominated by women. And so they claimed that they were paid to courier items such as clothing and electronics, and they were duped by their supplier, who concealed drugs in the lining of their bags. Furthermore, many of the women stated in their legal defences that they were engaged in couriering for gendered economic reasons. For example, they were divorced, a single mother, or they needed to pay for a relative's medical bills. And so they were either paid to courier something across a border, or they were looking for a job overseas, and they were duped into carrying drugs in the course of this arrangement. So overall, it seems that drug trafficking syndicates are capitalising and exploiting this transnational flow of female labour and duping female economic migrants into carrying drugs across borders. And activists in the region have been putting forward the argument that many of the women on death row for drug trafficking in Southeast Asia are in fact victims of human trafficking. This is because in many ways, their legal defences fit within the United Nations definition of human trafficking under the Palermo Protocol in terms of the methods of recruitment, transportation, deception, and exploitation of vulnerability, which is what the definition encompasses. And you might be wondering why there is a photo of McDonald's in Guangzhou, China on this slide. And this is because through my interviews with lawyers and also from reviewing court documents, I came across this trend whereby multiple women from China across a number of months and years had provided eerily similar defense testimonies where they claimed that they were employed by a Nigerian man who allegedly had a clothing factory in Guangzhou and had paid female couriers to export his clothing items to various locations across Asia, including Malaysia. And all of the women said that they'd had their business dealings with this man in a particular McDonald's in Guangzhou. And indeed, in the court documents, they provide details of their arrests. And you find that all of the women were arrested with the same brand of suitcase, containing clothing and roughly the same type and amount of drugs concealed within them. And this is over a number of years. And indeed, the Chinese society in Malaysia has also picked up on this trend and argued that these women who are on death row now are all victims of a Nigerian human trafficking ring. So through my research, I've been considering this human trafficking argument, which could be mobilized to good effect to get women off death row, because as I'm sure you know, if someone is classified as a victim of human trafficking, they're immune from criminal prosecution. However, classing migrant women as human trafficking victims is not without its issues, particularly as it may lead to increased surveillance at the border and possible restrictions on women's mobility. And there's plenty of feminist criminological literature on this, which I'd be happy to recommend. So I've spoken so far about why and how the women became involved in drug trafficking that leads to the death penalty in Malaysia. But perhaps of more interest to you as lawyers is the experiences of these foreign national women in the criminal justice system in Malaysia. And my supervisor at Oxford's, who's called Professor Carolyn Hoyle, has conducted research on this and finds that foreign national defendants are especially vulnerable when facing the death penalty in an alien criminal justice system. There's a UN convention called the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations, and this was signed in 1963. And crucially, Article 36(1)(b) requires that a nation arresting or detaining a foreign national must notify the relevant embassy or consulate and let the foreign detainee know about their rights to consular assistance. And this assistance can range from communicating with family members, providing a translator at your trial, providing financial assistance for a lawyer, and once convicted, providing pastoral care once in prison. And the arresting authorities must notify you and your consulate without delay. But in reality, in Malaysia, the type of consular assistance that foreign nationals receive differs greatly by nationality. And indeed, whether or not the Malaysian authorities notify the relevant embassies is also very variable. So basically, those who are citizens of nations with which they have close diplomatic ties are likely to be notified straight away and treated better in custody than those that the Malaysian authorities have less of an interest in retaining relations with. And often that corresponds with, citizens from more developed and Western nations such as the UK, the US, or Australia, being more likely to receive more support from their embassies and more likely that they will be detained and treated better, and they'll be treated better in detention and in custody. Whereas from this research, we found that quite a few African nationals found that their embassies were never ever notified of their arrest or even indeed their death sentence. And where their embassies were notified, they may not have had the financial means nor the inclination to provide them with support. Just as a side, the UK government policy is that they will not pay your lawyer directly if you were to be arrested on a capital charge abroad, but they instead fund charities such as Reprieve and the Death Penalty Project, who provide British nationals facing the death penalty abroad with legal assistance. Research from Monash University has also drawn attention to some fair trial concerns in capital cases in Malaysia. So firstly, when it comes to the presumption of innocence, this is reversed in drug trafficking cases, and the defendant is presumed guilty and the onus is on the defense to prove otherwise. This was recently found to be unconstitutional, but the legislation is yet to be amended, so there's still the presumption of innocence is reversed. This research also found that the clemency process, so when you've been sentenced to death and you've exhausted your appeals, you may apply to the head of state and ask them to have mercy on you. And this process in Malaysia is very opaque and arbitrary as well. And so that was another concern that they had raised. Finally, when it comes to foreign nationals, there are issues with language interpretation, as interpreters are only provided to the defendant in the courtroom, but not at the pretrial stages, e.g. during police investigations, which is obviously very problematic. A recent report was published by the Anti-Death Penalty Asia Network, which detailed the conditions on death row for both men and women in Malaysia. And the findings are pretty bleak. So death row prisoners are held in single cells for 23 hours every day. They have limited access to visitors and recreational activities. They have no access to educational or rehabilitative programs, and they're not allowed to work in prison. They also have quite strict rules about their visits. And as you can imagine, this situation is especially challenging for foreign national prisoners, many of whom have never received a visit before, as their families live abroad and may not be able to afford to travel. Language is also a big issue for foreign nationals who may not be able to communicate with their jailers or with medical staff, and only allowed books in Bahasa Malaysian, the local language. And so foreign nationals may not have any reading materials that they can understand. And finally, before I wrap up, in international jurisprudence, it has recognized what is called the death row phenomenon, where scientific studies have shown that those detained awaiting execution, particularly those in solitary confinement, face unduly high rates of psychiatric and psychological disorders, more so than those detained in kind of normal imprisonment. And some of the symptoms include paranoia, hallucinations, self-harm and suicidal thoughts, depression, loss of reality, etc. And they've termed this the death row phenomenon. And so in international law, detention on death row for more than 10 years is considered cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment and punishment. And so one of the sort of main pains of imprisonment of those on death row in Malaysia is the indeterminacy of the sentence and the fact that the threat of execution is constantly looming. So the full legal process usually takes at least 10 years until it's confirmed that you've exhausted your appeals. And this diagram comes from a report by the Anti-Death Penalty Asia Network and shows that in some cases in Malaysia, it takes up to 27 years for completion. And this is because after your trial at the High Court, you're able to appeal to the Court of Appeal, then the Federal Court, and then finally you may write to the King of Malaysia and request a royal pardon. But the royal pardons process is extremely opaque, and so prisoners await years to hear the outcome, and this causes extreme anxiety. And indeed, I will end this presentation now with a quotation from the ADPAN report coming from one of the death row inmates who stated that waiting for my clemency petition feels like hanging out of nowhere. Thank you so much for listening. I will conclude my presentation there.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. Thank you. Thank you very much.
I will stop sharing my screen. Oops.
No, not at all.
Wait, how do I do pause share? Has that worked?
Well, it might be paused because it's not moving, but it wasn't moving a second ago either, so
Okay.
I wouldn't necessarily know. It's certainly on the last slide.
Oh, stop now, I think.
That's done something now, certainly. There you go. Perfect.
Great.
That was really interesting. Thank you so much. I must say there was something that one of your slides that kind of surprised me. You said there were 579 executions a year. Maybe I'm just a horrendous pessimist, but I kind of thought there'd be more actually. I'm not saying that I'm glad there's not more, but at the same time, that number actually was a little bit less than I was expecting. I'm not entirely sure why. But you also said that it was an increase as well, that it was a 20% increase, was it, on the previous year? Is there some sort of reason why I might have thought that it's higher? Is there something maybe in the way this is reported, or I guess I was thinking of regimes like China that you mentioned, and I just kind of assumed that they had a kind of horrendous machinery in place that was, that would account for a lot of numbers.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So the statistic doesn't include regimes like China, where we don't have accurate numbers on the reporting. And also I should say that COVID has, slowed down things and there were fewer executions during the pandemic. But there's a bit of a lag between death sentences and executions because of legal safeguards. So in most countries that retain the death penalty, there's like a complex process of appeals and things. And so being sentenced to death doesn't mean that you are immediately going to be executed, thank goodness. So that might also explain some of the disparities. But yeah, I think it might be a reporting issue. It's quite hard to get data.
So usually what happens is I'll ask a few questions in the meantime just to try and play for time, and that I'll be put in the comment section to add a few questions that we can then then turn to. So there was something you said that I thought was kind of interesting, because you were quite sort of it was a point that I think you thought was not a very good point, but actually to me it resonated a little bit more than maybe you would have liked. And it was this idea that a lot of the regimes put forward this notion that a drug trafficker can be responsible for a lot of deaths, and therefore it is comparable to a murderer, and it exists on that kind of same legal plane of seriousness. And I was somewhat sympathetic. I mean, I'm not someone who's in favor of the death penalty, but I do understand the idea that someone who is responsible for a sophisticated, large trafficking network doubtlessly contributes to a lot of deaths. And so I'm just wondering kind of what your thoughts are on that. And I'm sure it's something that these governments in question kind of manipulate in the way they present it to the public and things like that. But I was just curious on your thoughts.
Yeah, so those who are usually subject to the death penalty for drug trafficking are not those who are at the top of a drug syndicate. It's usually really low-level mules who might be motivated by economic precarity, might be vulnerable or duped into it. And so those who are subject to the death penalty for drug trafficking are not those who are major profiteers or powerful members of drug trafficking syndicates. So yeah, it tends to target those at the lowest end, the lowest rungs of the process. So yeah, I guess that would be my rebuttal of that.
But I think I probably have you right in saying that you're not in favor of capital punishment, period. Yeah.
Yes.
Can I ask why not? What's your rationale for that? Because you gave quite a sort of data-driven argument tonight, but my suspicion is that belief of yours probably isn't rooted in data.
Well, I think I return to the side about the issues with capital punishment. So issues to do with wrongful convictions, how it often targets those most marginalized in society and therefore is quite an arbitrary punishment. Issues to do with fair trial concerns, and so on. And also, I guess, more sort of philosophically, I'm not in agreement with the state's right to take a human life.
That's sort of what I was waiting for. My master's is in philosophy as well, and that's sort of my position, is that I don't agree with the death penalty, and it's because I don't believe that the state should be in a position of authority to take the life of a citizen. I think that's a fundamentally troublesome arrangement. It's very difficult when you think of the idea that the state is something that's put in place by the citizen. It's very problematic for there to be a lever in the hand of the state where it can kill the citizen, even in a rare circumstance. That to me doesn't quite sit right in terms of the way that relationship should operate, and I find that quite interesting. But I think it's interesting that the things that you came to first were questions about fair trials and miscarriages of justice and things like that. For some reason, those arguments seem more persuasive to more people. I think that there's quite a large group of individuals who actually capital punishment isn't philosophically something that they take a problem with, but they're sympathetic to arguments about wrongful convictions and things like that. I think that's really interesting. Quite a large proportion of Britain still supports capital punishment when we do polling on this. Do you happen to know what the most recent sort of figure is? Just
That's a good question. I don't actually know. I'd have to turn to Google.
I thought it was somewhere around the half mark, apparently. So I've been told it's somewhere around the halfway mark. It certainly was in the majority until not that long ago. I turned to Google too, don't worry. That's where I got it. I'm just wondering why you might think that's the case, because I find it really interesting that still, when you look at the law has been so much more advanced in relation to this position than public opinion. And usually we think of those things in reverse. Usually we think of the law kind of lagging behind public opinion a little bit. And it's really interesting that in this scenario, the law seems to have led the way somewhat.
Yeah, well, there have been some really interesting studies of public opinion and the death penalty in other jurisdictions. And what these studies have shown is that often polls aren't a very reliable, or we need to look at the methodology behind it. So often people are more likely to support the death penalty in the abstract But when it comes to presenting participants with realistic case studies about the death penalty and how it might be applied, their support for it quickly sort of wanes, because they realize, oh, actually, if I was presented with X person who had been accused of this crime, I'm not actually in support of them having the death penalty. So I think it's easier to support in the abstract than to think about the reality of it as a form of punishment, which might be why some of the public opinion polls might suggest a stronger support than we might have thought.
Yeah, you might even take it as a kind of poll on sort of the fear or the contempt for criminality and things like that, rather than a really substantive view, but potentially on whether we want the death penalty back. You've pulled off a slight coup tonight, and that you've taken the host position, which means that if you, that's absolutely fine. It just means that if you want to allow someone to ask you a question, there are two hands that are raised in the attendees panel. If you click allow to speak next to them, that would let them speak to you, if you want to let them speak to you.
I'm sorry, I also haven't been monitoring the chat. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to be doing that.
You've had a huge amount of questions that have come in. So why don't we go with Jacqueline Fletcher, and then maybe I'll pull one out the chat before we finish up.
Sure.
I can see the chat though as well. I've been neglecting it just like you have.
Okay.
Hello, can you hear me from Amsterdam?
Hi, Jacqueline. Yes,
like Eurovision.
Absolutely, I can hear you.
I just want to say thank you for such an interesting talk. Like many, I'd often thought about the death penalty within the American context. You touched upon President Duterte of the Philippines, who made the war on drugs a really key part of his election campaign. And having a background in politics before studying law, I was just curious as to your thoughts on the ways that the death penalty is used by political actors in order to gain leverage with voters and support, and what impact do you think this rhetoric might not just have on a state's criminal justice system but the wider democracy? You know, is it used to disproportionately punish others, as you mentioned, or women from other countries? And yeah, I'd just be really interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So I think fundamentally it's kind of inappropriate for populist leaders to use the death penalty as a way to, score some cheap political points, I guess, on the backs of people's fear of crime, but without really explaining the full ramifications of who is targeted by the death penalty and how that works out in practice. And in the Philippines, where more of the issue is perhaps extrajudicial killings rather than the death penalty, because they don't currently have the death penalty. That reminds me that, if you have the death penalty on the books, then I don't necessarily have empirical evidence to back this up, but just logically, it seems like it then legitimizes the state being able to take a life, which might have other ramifications for, extrajudicial killings. If it is seen as legitimate that, someone who is involved with drugs can be killed by the state, then perhaps that might, make people feel like other forms of lethal violence are more legitimate. I don't know. That's just that's sort of a tentative thought about that. So yeah, I think perhaps it could be used to legitimize lethal violence, I suppose. Not sure if that...
Let me pull one from the chat, and then I'll abuse my position and finish with one for myself as well.
Sure.
So your research speaks about the victims in these situations as being distinctively and characteristically female in nature. And so this person's asking, does that entail a patriarchal power as well? Is that a kind of implied part of your research, or a necessary part of your research? Not just that the victims in question are female and therefore that feminist scholarship is relevant, but also that the systems in which they're falling prey is patriarchal in its nature.
Wait, sorry, I got slightly distracted by the chat. Would you mind just repeating?
Not at all, of course, yeah. So that in your research, it seems that it's quite important that the victims in question are female. And so this person is asking, is the other side of that aspect, that the systems in which they're falling foul is patriarchal? Is it necessary that these people are falling victim to a patriarchal society or a patriarchal power structure, potentially a legal structure? Essentially, that does the female nature of the victims entail you know, a patriarchal perpetrator, if you like, or a patriarchal system that's neglecting them and neglecting to treat them fairly. Does that make sense? I may have completely I may have garbled the question somewhat in trying to ask it.
No. Yeah, I would say I don't, in my work, I don't use the terminology of victims, because I think obviously women have agency, and so I don't want to make it seem like, you know, every woman whose cases I have researched are, you know, hapless victims without any power. But I would say that kind of goes to the structure agency, you know, a really big argument. But what my research was looking at was how sort of global economic structures were might exclude women, and how they therefore might turn to you know, informal forms of generating income, which may lead them to becoming involved in drug trafficking unintendedly. So I suppose the kind of structures that I was interested in looking at from a feminist perspective were like global economic structures, which is why I talk a lot about economic migration and the feminization of migration. And so those were the structures in particular that I was interested in looking at.
So the person didn't use the word victims. That was myself that did that. Just out of curiosity,
Oh,
what language? No, what language do you use? Because I'm guessing you don't talk in terms of perpetrators really, and language like that. What sort of language do you use to describe the people that you're talking about?
I guess just, you know, the women involved whose cases I was reporting on. Yeah.
Try to take a neutrality sort of position that you spoke. Fair enough.
Yeah.
So I guess my last little one then is, so this obviously seems to have quite a big political dimension to it, and politics globally appears to be more tolerant of authoritarianism than maybe it has been in sort of recent years. If we were having this discussion in 10 years' time, would you be telling me that things had gotten better, or would you think that things have gotten worse for the people that you've been researching?
I would like to be optimistic and say that things have gotten better. I just in Malaysia in particular, the human rights movement is really strong, and so I like to think that so they're currently discussing abolishing the mandatory death penalty, but I'm hopeful that, you know, in the next step to that, you know, that will just be a step on the way to full abolition of the death penalty. So yeah, I'll end on an optimistic note.
We always send a little gift of thanks for people who do this, so we've sent a little thank you gift to you to the Death Penalty Research Unit in Oxford. So, you should get that on Wednesday morning. But thank you so much for joining us, and I think people in the chat would also agree that it was really insightful and really interesting. So thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Much appreciated.